I'm Hannah, and I will be presenting on projective testing today, specifically on the house tree person test. So what is projective testing in the first place? Well, when we talk about a projective test or a projective measure, we mean one in which the test taker responds to a variety of different stimuli, often in the form of pictures and drawings, and in doing so, they subconsciously reveal underlying aspects of their personality. And this can be useful for assessing for emotional and behavioral disorders because its methods can reveal underlying emotions and attitudes of the individual being tested. And in general, projective tests are the umbrella to a variety of different assessments that include completing sentence blanks, drawing images, or telling stories. Some projective measures include apperception tests, sentence completion tests, the Rorschach test, and drawing tests. So today's specific test that we're going to be talking about is a form of a drawing test. And a drawing test in particular is just a projective technique that attempts to screen an individual's feelings about self, home, and family. So a house tree person test is actually a projective assessment that was created in 1948 by psychologist John Buck, and it was later revised in 1969. And it's a type of drawing test intended for children and adults that's used to measure various aspects of personality through their drawings of a house, a tree, and a person. These interpretations of these drawings are then used to provide insight into the subject's cognitive, emotional, and social functioning, which is why the house tree person test, or the HTP, is useful for assessing for EBD, as it provides insight into underlying emotions, internal attitudes, traits, and behaviors. In terms of its administration, it's quite low maintenance in that it only requires a pencil, a crayon, if at all, and 3 sheets of white blank paper. While the test takes approximately 150 minutes to administer and complete, the test taker is given an unlimited amount of time to complete the drawings necessary. And furthermore, this test must be administered by a highly trained and highly experienced psychologist, psychiatrist, or school counselor, just due to the nature of the subjective quality of this type of test. In terms of the methodology, the HTP consists of 3 main parts. The first, the nonverbal drawing part, in which the test taker is instructed to draw a house, a tree, and a person as accurately as possible on 3 separate sheets of paper. These drawings are made with pencil or crayon or both. It's flexible and it depends on the examiner. The second part is the verbal questioning and response phase, in which the test taker then answers questions the examiner asks about their drawings. And these questions are provided in Buck's manual, but the trained test givers have flexibility to give their own and ask their own follow-up questions. And finally, part 3 consists of the examiner's analysis and interpretation of these drawings and verbal responses. So in terms of a formal scoring or interpretation method, this test is quite subjective in nature, and therefore the scoring and interpretation is going to be extremely qualitative. They rely on the subjective reading of the drawings and verbal responses, so they can vary from different examiners and different test takers across the board. But every drawing definitely symbolizes underlying feelings and emotions existing in the individual at hand, which is why the examiner must be highly experienced and trained, because they need to know how to read into these interpretations in a very specific way. So when we interpret these results, there are 4 main pillars that are being analyzed in these drawings the examiner is taking into account. And these include the dimensions of the drawings, meaning the size of the objects, the strokes, lines, and shading of the drawing, so the pressure of the lines, the firmness and the solidity, the clarity of the drawing, so the details present, and these can reveal, flexibility or rigidity of a personality or an ego strength. And finally, the placement and positionality of the objects presented in the drawings. And placement and positionality are so important because they can reveal a lot about underlying emotions and behaviors in terms of where it's placed on the paper and the positionality of the objects themselves. And we'll get to that when we interpret each drawing. So in terms of those specific interpretations, when we think about the house, we think of the house as a reflection of one's family relations and family values. So when we look at the house, we look at the roof, the doors and the windows, the wall, the pathways, and we see if all of or any of these relate to how the person is feeling on the inside. For example, if my windows are open, I might relay a sense of openness and ability to change, whereas if I'm being presented with clearly locked and closed doors and closed shutters, I might present the opposite, a more closed and closed-minded and scared feeling to my examiner. And when we think about the tree, we think of the tree as suggestive of the innermost unconscious aspects of the personality. So in looking at the tree drawing, we would look at the tree trunk as an indicator of inner strength or needs, and we would look at the branches as reflective of the person's relationship with the external world. For example, if there are a lack of branches, this might indicate minimal contact with other people. And then when we talk about and think about the person drawing, we think of the person as a representation of the ideal self and one's social interactions. So in this drawing, the examiner would pay close attention to the arms and hands for behavioral traits, the legs and feet for inherent emotions, maybe fear, maybe a closed stance is closed off, whereas an open stance is more open and accessible emotionally. We would look at the face for a desired self-presentation or communicativeness, and then we would look at gender, primarily because whatever the gender of the drawing of the person is, if it matches the test taker, then that is usually a reflective of the test taker themselves, whereas if the gender doesn't match the test taker, it would indicate that the picture is of someone else. And that would be a moment to dive in there. Above all, placement and details and positionality definitely matter. So we're just going to run through a sample analysis of what this might look like in analyzing someone's real drawings. So the house drawing here, I see a house drawing on the right. I see an absence of a chimney. This might indicate a lack of psychological warmth. Even though it's quite light, this house was drawn at the base of the paper, and this might indicate some basic insecurities or fear of taking up space. I'm noticing a one-dimensional roof, indicative of maybe the test taker is unimaginative or emotionally constricted. I'm seeing open shutters, which has a positive indication of an ability to make interpersonal adjustments. In terms of this person's tree drawing, I'm seeing exaggerated emphasis on the trunk, which could indicate emotional immaturity in the individual. We see fruits, which might indicate that the individual is family or child-minded or immature. And then we're also seeing reinforced shading with those fruits and those shadings of the trunk. And this might indicate hostile or aggressive behaviors towards others. And finally, we see this person's person drawing, in which we're seeing a possible reflection of emotional immobility with the short legs. We see the arms are specifically positioned behind the back, which might indicate a desire to control anger, interpersonal reluctance. And then we see large squared out shoulders, which indicates a preoccupation with the perceived need for strength. And so in general, to wrap up, we see that the house tree person test is, because it's so subjectively scored, its reliability and validity are quite low across the board. However, HTP can continue to be useful for assessing for EBD when it's combined with the results of several other test measures and other techniques for testing for EBD, such as observations, the BASC, the ABC, the FBA, and other alternative projective testing measures. It is interesting to note that while the HTP doesn't have incredibly high reliability or validity, there is some evidence that it can differentiate people with specific types of brain damage. So specifically, it has been shown effective when looking at brain damage present in schizophrenic patients. So that's all for today on the house tree person test. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation.